Rain fell upon London with the patience of judgment, thin and unrelenting, as though the city itself had resolved to remember every slight it had ever inflicted. Gas lamps blurred into trembling halos along the street, their reflections fractured across the slick cobblestones like broken promises. Carriages rolled past with indifferent splendor, wheels hissing through puddles, each one bearing souls still permitted the comfort of belonging. She stood at the edge of the pavement, gloved hands clasped too tightly, her spine held straight by habit rather than hope. Miss Eleanor Harrow, though the name now moved through drawing rooms with a softness reserved for caution, had emerged moments earlier from a townhouse whose doors had closed behind her with decisive finality. There had been no raised voices within, no theatrical display of anger. Polite words had been spoken instead, trimmed and proper, each syllable sharpened by disappointment. An engagement, once announced with smiles and delicate applause, had been withdrawn, as one might retract a hand from a flame. Society had not required the details. It rarely did. A woman need only be seen departing alone, her cheeks pale and her eyes too bright, for the verdict to be delivered with ruthless efficiency. Already, figures lingered near curtained windows. Already, fans fluttered and paused. Eleanor felt their curiosity press against her back like cold breath. She did not turn. To do so would have been an acknowledgment, and she had learned, painfully, thoroughly, that dignity was sometimes the only possession left unseized. The rain darkened the hem of her cloak, heavy wool drinking in the night. She focused on her breathing, on the measured rise and fall she had practiced since girlhood, when composure was praised more highly than happiness. Her mother had taught her that restraint was armor. This evening, it felt no thicker than lace. A carriage waited at the curb. Or rather, a carriage waited, its lamps lit, its door ajar, its driver motionless atop the seat. Eleanor did not look closely. The humiliation of the last hour had left her vision narrowed, as though the world beyond her immediate path had dissolved into irrelevance. She stepped forward, lifted her skirts, and entered without hesitation. The door closed behind her with a sound far more solid than she expected. At once, she knew her mistake. The interior was too spacious, the cushions too fine. The velvet beneath her fingers bore an embroidered crest, subtle, elegant, unmistakably noble. The air carried a faint trace of bergamot and leather, a scent of permanence rather than higher. Eleanor's breath caught. She turned toward the door, already reaching for the handle, when the carriage lurched into motion. Her heart stuttered. The city outside began to slide past the windows, blurred by rain and speed. Panic threatened, sharp and undignified, but she forced it down, schooling her features even as her pulse raced. It was then that she realized she was not alone. Opposite her sat a woman of composed elegance, her posture relaxed, her gaze keen. She was neither young nor old, her beauty the kind sharpened by intelligence rather than ornament. A bonnet rested beside her, dark hair swept neatly back, revealing eyes that missed very little. Those eyes now studied Eleanor with open interest. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence stretched, heavy with implication. "I beg your pardon," Eleanor said at last, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt beneath it. "I fear I have entered your carriage in error. If you would be so kind as to instruct your driver to stop." The woman's lips curved, not unkindly, but with a glint of amusement that suggested she was already several steps ahead. "If error were so easily corrected," she replied, "London would be a gentler place." Eleanor flushed, mortified by the accuracy of the remark. "I assure you, madam, this was not my intention." "I believe you," the woman said, and then, after a pause deliberate enough to command attention, she added, "which makes it all the more interesting." The carriage continued onward, the rhythm of its wheels underscoring Eleanor's unease. She folded her hands in her lap, determined not to betray fear. "I must insist," she said softly, "that I be set down at once." "In a moment," the woman replied. "First, allow me to apologize. I should have spoken sooner. My silence was indulgent. She inclined her head. Lady Margaret Ashcombe. The name landed with quiet force. Eleanor knew it, as most in society did. Sister to the Duke of Ashcombe, a woman rumored to manage half her brother's affairs and all of his defenses. Eleanor inclined her head in return. Miss Eleanor Harrow. Recognition flickered. Brief. Assessing. Lady Margaret's gaze softened, not with pity, but with something closer to understanding. Ah, she murmured. Then tonight has been uncommonly unkind to you. The words, so plainly spoken, nearly undid her. Eleanor swallowed. It has been instructive. Lady Margaret laughed, a low sound, devoid of cruelty. You are remarkably composed for someone freshly wounded. One learns, Eleanor said. What must be borne in silence? Indeed, Lady Margaret replied. She leaned back, studying Eleanor anew. And what must not? The carriage slowed at last, turning through iron gates that rose to admit them. Beyond, a drive unfurled, lanterns glowing like watchful eyes along its length. Eleanor's breath faltered as the outline of the estate emerged, vast, assured, immutable. I truly cannot remain, Eleanor said, though the words felt thin now. This misunderstanding has gone far enough. Lady Margaret smiled then, fully and without apology. My dear Miss Harrow, misunderstandings are merely truths waiting for their proper moment. She gestured toward the window. You may leave, if you wish. No one will stop you. But I wonder, when you stepped into this carriage, did you not, for one reckless instant, hope it might carry you somewhere else? Eleanor said nothing. Hope, she had learned, was a dangerous indulgence. The carriage came to a halt. The door opened. Rain whispered against stone. Eleanor hesitated, suspended between dignity and exhaustion. Lady Margaret rose, extending a gloved hand, not as command but invitation. Her voice, when she spoke, was gentle and utterly certain. Come inside. Dry yourself. Drink tea. Tomorrow, you may return to London exactly as you left it. But tonight, her eyes gleamed. Tonight, you are precisely where you ought to be. Eleanor looked at the hand, at the estate, at the path she had not chosen yet somehow found. She took a breath and stepped forward. Behind the tall windows of the house, unseen and silent, a man stood watching the rain, unaware that fate had already crossed his threshold. Morning did not arrive at Ashcombe Estate so much as it revealed itself, pale light filtering through tall windows, with the restraint of a guest who knew she was being watched. Eleanor woke in a chamber that was not hers, surrounded by quiet luxury that neither flaunted nor apologized for its presence. The bed curtains were drawn back, the sheets crisp, the hearth newly laid. For a moment, disorientation threatened her composure. Then memory returned, rain velvet, a woman's discerning eyes, and with it, the awareness that she now occupied a space where every step carried consequence. She rose before a maid could be summoned, unwilling to appear ungrateful, yet more unwilling to seem dependent. At the washstand, she studied her reflection, noting the faint shadows beneath her eyes, the careful order of her hair. She had not slept deeply, but she had slept without fear, and that alone unsettled her. Comfort, she had learned, often exacted a price. When she descended to the morning room, Lady Margaret awaited her, already seated with a cup of tea and a ledger open at her elbow. The fire burned low, and beyond the windows the ground stretched in deliberate symmetry, a landscape shaped by generations of control. You rise early, Lady Margaret observed, her tone approving rather than surprised. I prefer not to presume upon hospitality, Eleanor replied. I am grateful for your kindness, but I must trouble you no further than necessary. Lady Margaret closed the ledger. Kindness is rarely trouble, she said, and necessity is a flexible thing. They took tea together in companionable quiet, Lady Margaret allowing silence to do its work. Eleanor sensed the unspoken questions hovering between them, But she would not volunteer explanations that had not been requested. She had learned long ago that a woman's words could be twisted more easily than her silence. It was Lady Margaret who spoke at last. "My brother will be joining us shortly." Eleanor's hand stilled on her cup. She had known this moment would come, yet the knowledge did not soften its impact. "I was not aware the Duke was in residence." "He is," Lady Margaret said simply, "and he is observant." The implication settled like a weight. Eleanor inclined her head. "Then I must apologize in advance for any inconvenience my presence may cause him." Lady Margaret's smile was faint. "My brother is not inconvenienced by people. He is inconvenienced by pretense." Before Eleanor could respond, footsteps sounded in the corridor. She did not look up at once. To do so felt too deliberate. Instead, she focused on the pattern of the carpet, the measured cadence of her breathing. The Duke of Ashcombe entered without ceremony. He was taller than she had expected, his presence restrained yet undeniable, as though the room had adjusted itself to accommodate him. His expression was composed, his dark hair neatly cut, his attire precise, without ostentation. He carried himself with the ease of one accustomed to authority, but not enamored of it. "Margaret," he said, his voice low, steady. Then his gaze shifted, and for the briefest instant, Eleanor felt it rest upon her with unguarded attention. Not appraisal, not judgment attention. "Your Grace," Eleanor said, rising smoothly. "Miss Harrow," he replied, inclining his head. There was no surprise in his tone, only acknowledgment, as though her presence, however unexpected, had already been accounted for. They sat. Conversation resumed, careful at first, revolving around neutral topics, the weather's relentlessness, the state of the roads, the minor irritations of London society. Yet beneath each exchange lay an awareness that something far more precarious was unfolding. Eleanor spoke little, but when she did, the Duke listened. She noticed it in the way his gaze did not wander, in the way he neither interrupted nor hurried her words. It was an attention she had not been afforded in some time, and it unsettled her more than open scrutiny would have. Later, as Lady Margaret excused herself on the pretense of correspondence, a silence settled between them, heavier now for the absence of mediation. Eleanor felt the instinctive urge to fill it, to justify her presence, but she resisted. Dignity, she reminded herself, required restraint. "I am aware," the Duke said at last, "that your arrival here was unintentional." "Yes," Eleanor replied, "entirely so. And yet," he continued, "you remain." She met his gaze then, finding no accusation there. "Only until it is appropriate for me to depart." "Appropriate," he repeated, considering the word. London has a particular fondness for appropriateness. It often disguises cruelty beneath it. Eleanor's composure wavered, just enough to reveal the truth beneath. "London has been very clear in its assessment of me." "I have found," the Duke said, "that clarity and accuracy are not synonymous." The word struck her with unexpected force. She looked away, unsettled by the gentleness of his tone. "Your Grace, I have no wish to entangle you in matters that will inevitably invite speculation." "Speculation thrives regardless of consent," he replied. "What matters is how one chooses to respond to it." Their exchange was interrupted by the arrival of a footman bearing a small parcel. The Duke accepted it, glancing at the seal before handing it to Eleanor. "This was found among the effects brought with you last evening. I believe it is yours." Eleanor recognized the book at once, a modest volume of poetry, its leather cover worn smooth by frequent handling. She accepted it with a murmured thanks, her fingers brushing the edge where a pressed wildflower rested, fragile and faded. A private token, never meant to be seen. The Duke noticed. His expression softened, though he did not comment. It was later that day, as Eleanor prepared to leave the estate, that the first whispers reached them. A carriage had been seen, a name repeated, questions asked with too much interest to be innocent. Lady Margaret listened to the reports with a satisfied calm. "London will talk," she said, meeting Eleanor's gaze. "It always does. The question is whether one allows it to define the narrative." Eleanor felt a familiar tightening in her chest. "I have no desire to become a subject of further scrutiny." Lady Margaret's smile was sharp, not unkind. "My dear, you already are." That evening, at dinner, the Duke spoke again, his voice carrying just far enough to be heard by those who mattered. "Miss Harrow will remain as my guest for the duration of the week." The room stilled. Eleanor's breath caught, her pulse quickening. The Duke did not look at her as he spoke, but when he did, there was no hesitation in his gaze. Outside, the rain began anew, and with it, the certainty that retreat was no longer possible. Dusk gathered itself within the walls of Ashcombe like a held breath, the last light thinning into amber threads that clung to the edges of tall windows. The estate grew quieter as evening advanced, servants withdrawing with practiced discretion, corridors dimming until footsteps sounded louder than intention. Eleanor found herself drawn toward the library not by invitation, but by the peculiar gravity of a place where thoughts were permitted to linger without immediate consequence. The room was long and solemn, lined with shelves that rose toward a ceiling darkened by age and candle smoke. A fire burned low on the hearth, its glow catching the spines of books and the polished surface of a large oak table. Rain traced the windows in erratic lines, each drop a reminder of the world pressing in beyond the glass. She stood near the mantel, her hands clasped, her posture composed. Yet beneath that composure lay a tautness she could no longer ignore. The days since her arrival had passed with deceptive calm, each hour layering meaning upon her presence. She had felt it in the glances exchanged at dinner, in the careful politeness of guests who pretended not to speculate, in Lady Margaret's quiet satisfaction. Most of all, she felt it in the Duke's attention, measured, deliberate, impossible to dismiss. When he entered the library, Eleanor sensed him before she heard him. He closed the door behind him, the sound soft yet decisive, and for a moment neither spoke. The fire shifted, casting light across his features, revealing lines of restraint rather than severity. He did not approach at once, allowing the space between them to remain intact, as though honoring the boundaries she had not voiced. "You wish to speak with me," Eleanor said, breaking the silence with a steadiness she did not entirely feel. "I did," he replied. "And so I believe, did you?" The truth of it settled between them. Eleanor inclined her head. "It seems avoidance would serve neither of us." "No," he agreed quietly. He moved then, not closer to her, but toward the table, resting his hand upon its edge as though anchoring himself. "You are aware," he said, "that your presence here has already been noticed." "Yes, and that speculation will not diminish with time." "Yes." He looked at her fully now, his gaze unwavering. "Then tell me why you remain." The question was not accusatory. It was an invitation, and Eleanor felt its weight keenly. She drew a breath, choosing her words with care. "Because I was offered shelter when I had none. Because leaving at once would appear an admission of guilt I do not bear. And because," she hesitated, the admission pressing against her ribs, "because I am tired of fleeing judgments that have already been rendered." The Duke listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he nodded once, as though acknowledging a truth he had anticipated. "London is adept at convincing women that endurance is their sole virtue." Eleanor's lips curved faintly. "It is a lesson taught early and reinforced often." He studied her then, not as society might, but as one person seeking to understand another. "You have been wronged," he said, "not merely by circumstance, but by intent." The words struck her more deeply than she expected. "You cannot know that." "I know enough," he replied, "and I know this. I will not allow my house to become another tribunal." Emotion stirred, sharp and unwelcome. Eleanor turned toward the window, focusing on the rain to regain her composure. "Your Grace," she said, her voice quieter now. Your protection, however gracious, carries its own risks. I would not have you regret extending it. I do not act without consideration, he said. After a pause, he added, nor without memory. She glanced back at him. Memory. He exhaled slowly, as though weighing the cost of disclosure. There was a time, he began, when I believed duty and affection could coexist without conflict. I was mistaken. His gaze shifted, not away from her, but inward. I trusted in appearances. I mistook compliance for sincerity. When the truth revealed itself, it did so with efficiency and without mercy. Eleanor listened, sensing the restraint beneath his words. You were betrayed. Yes, he said simply, and I learned how swiftly society absolves itself by assigning blame elsewhere. The admission altered something between them, narrowing the distance without diminishing its propriety. Then you understand, Eleanor said softly, what is to be spoken of as though one were absent. I do, he replied, which is why I am cautious. About me, she asked. About myself, he corrected. If I act, Miss Harrow, it will not be to appease curiosity or to play benefactor. I will not extend gestures that invite interpretation without intention. The fire crackled, punctuating the moment. Eleanor felt the significance of his words settle upon her, equal parts reassurance and warning. I ask for nothing beyond fairness, she said, and I offer nothing less, he replied. They stood in silence, the air between them charged not with desire, but with recognition. Eleanor was acutely aware of her own vulnerability, of how easily hope could take root in such soil. She would not allow it to flourish unchecked. I will leave, she said at last. Soon. Before my presence becomes an inconvenience you must justify. The Duke's brow furrowed, the first visible sign of disturbance she had seen from him. You assume I would choose convenience. She met his gaze, holding it this time. I assume you would choose honor. A slow smile touched his lips, fleeting but genuine. Honor has a way of complicating matters. Before she could respond, the door opened, and Lady Margaret entered, her expression observant as ever. She took in the scene with swift comprehension, noting the distance between them, the tension unresolved. I trust one am not interrupting, she said mildly. Only a conversation, the Duke replied. Ah, Lady Margaret said. Those are rarely harmless. She turned to Eleanor. My dear, there is something you should know. The invitations for the Hartwell Assembly have been amended. Eleanor's pulse quickened. Amended how? Lady Margaret smiled, her eyes alight with purpose. Your name has been included. Eleanor's breath caught. To appear publicly under such circumstances was to invite judgment anew, or to challenge it outright. She looked to the Duke, searching his expression. He met her gaze steadily. I will not compel you, he said, but if you attend, you will not do so alone. The implication was clear, and its consequences unmistakable. Eleanor felt fear and resolve entwine within her, each lending strength to the other. I will attend, she said. Lady Margaret's smile widened, satisfied, as the fire burned lower and the rain softened into a steady hush. Eleanor understood that the choice she had made would alter more than her own standing. It would test the Duke's restraint, provoke society's appetite, and demand a courage she had long been forced to conceal. Yet as she left the library that evening, she did so not with shame, but with a quiet certainty that whatever awaited her would be faced, not fled. The Hartwell Assembly unfolded beneath a canopy of crystal and candlelight, a space meticulously arranged to celebrate refinement while quietly testing it. Chandeliers scattered light across silk and satin, catching in the folds of gowns and the polished edges of restraint. Music drifted through the hall, elegant and measured, as though even sound were mindful of propriety. Eleanor stood at the threshold, the murmur of voices swelling and subsiding like a tide, each whisper carrying the faint possibility of judgment. She had dressed with intention rather than display. Her gown was of subdued ivory, its lines simple, its craftsmanship evident without ostentation. It neither invited scrutiny nor deflected it, and she had chosen it precisely for that reason. When she stepped forward, the subtle pause that rippled through the room confirmed what she already knew. Her presence had been anticipated. At her side, the Duke of Ashcombe moved with unhurried assurance. He did not offer his arm until she reached for it, an acknowledgment rather than a claim. Together, they advanced into the assembly, their pace unhurried, their composure intact. Eleanor felt the weight of countless gazes, yet she did not shrink beneath them. If she was to be observed, she would be observed standing. Conversation faltered, then resumed with exaggerated ease. Names were exchanged, compliments offered, inquiries made with careful neutrality. Eleanor answered each with poise, neither defensive nor eager to please. She sensed the Duke's attention beside her, steady and unobtrusive, a presence that did not overshadow but fortified. Lady Margaret observed from a distance, her satisfaction evident in the slight lift of her brow as she watched society recalibrate its assumptions. She had orchestrated this moment with precision, but now she allowed it to unfold without interference. The outcome, she knew, would depend not on manipulation, but on choice. As the evening progressed, Eleanor found herself engaged in conversation with those who had once dismissed her. Their courtesy was immaculate, their curiosity thinly veiled. She responded with grace, offering neither confession nor explanation. The Duke spoke when necessary, his words measured, his tone carrying the quiet authority of one who neither defended nor apologized. It was enough. Yet the true test came when a familiar voice cut through the ambient murmur, sharp with feigned concern. A woman of notable influence, her smile too precise to be sincere, addressed Eleanor directly. "It is so good to see you again, Miss Harrow. One does worry after such abrupt changes." The room seemed to lean closer, attentive beneath its civility. Eleanor felt the moment stretch, the choice before her stark. She could retreat into vagueness, allow implication to linger unchallenged, or she could claim the narrative denied her. Before she could respond, the Duke spoke. "Miss Harrow is my guest," he said, his voice calm yet resonant. "Any concern for her welfare may be addressed to me." Silence followed, swift and complete. The woman's smile faltered, then recovered with practiced agility. "Of course, Your Grace. I meant no offense." "None taken," he replied, though the finality in his tone left no room for further inquiry. Eleanor looked at him then, meeting his gaze. In his expression, she found no triumph, only resolve. The acknowledgment passed between them was quiet, but it carried the weight of decision. Later, as the assembly drew toward its close and the music softened into a gentle refrain, the Duke led Eleanor toward the far end of the hall, where tall windows opened onto a moonlit terrace. The air beyond was cool, the night clear, the sounds of the gathering muted by distance. "I would not have spoken for you," he said, once they were alone, "had you wished otherwise." "I know," Eleanor replied, "and yet I am grateful." He regarded her thoughtfully. "Gratitude is not what I seek." She waited, her pulse quickening. "I have considered," he continued, "the implications of my actions. I am not unaware of the consequences, nor am I inclined to dismiss them lightly." He paused, choosing his words with care. "But I find that restraint, when practiced too rigidly, can become its own form of cowardice." Eleanor's breath caught. "What are you saying?" "That I will not allow you to be diminished within my presence," he said, "nor will I pretend indifference where there is none." The honesty of the admission left her momentarily unsteady. "Your Grace," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "such declarations invite scrutiny that may never relent." "I am accustomed to scrutiny," he replied. "What I am not accustomed to is regret." He offered his hand, not as a gesture of possession, but of intention. Eleanor looked at it, then at him, weighing the certainty she saw there against the fear that lingered within her. At last, she placed her hand in his. The contact was brief, restrained, yet it conveyed more than any embrace could have. In that moment, Eleanor understood that dignity reclaimed was not merely a defense, but a foundation upon which something enduring might be built. When they returned to the assembly, they did so together, their composure unaltered, their alignment unmistakable. Society would speak, as it always did. Whispers would persist, narratives would be reshaped. Yet Eleanor felt no urge to listen. For the first time in many months, she sensed the possibility of a future not defined by apology. As the final notes of music faded and guests began their departures, Eleanor glanced once more at the Duke, finding in his expression a quiet promise, one not spoken aloud, but no less binding for its silence. The carriage that bore her away that night was familiar now, its motion steady, its destination certain, and as the estate receded into the darkness behind her, Eleanor allowed herself a single, measured breath of hope, aware that the path ahead would demand courage, but assured that she would no longer walk it alone.